Hello everyone and welcome to this week's lecture. This is week 5 and we are looking at rewriting Hamlet, dramatic, poetic and prose responses. So we're going to be talking about 4 different authors this week and the ways in which they've revisited Shakespearean text, particularly Hamlet. In the first part of the lecture I'm going to have a look at the idea of reading and writing. So reading originals and then writing your own originals in response to those. So I'm going to start off with that. Then we're going to look at the biographies of some of the authors and think about the identity politics, which is often involved in ideas of rewriting. And in the final section, we're going to look more deeply at that and imagine where you fit into the whole system as readers and then hopefully rewriters in your own right. Of some aspects at least of these texts during your studies. So we'll start off with the idea of reading and writing. I want to look at, I just picked this because it's interesting more than anything else. It's a random example of somebody talking about the way that reading has influenced their writing. And it's the author Min Jin Lee, the Korean author Min Jin Lee, a Korean-American author. Talking about her experience of reading the Bible and rewriting aspects of that. For example, in some of her recent fiction, she writes both about stories of her own Korean ancestors and other Korean people that she's interviewed, she's met, she's heard their stories. But in many ways, she's also basing their stories on biblical originals. They're playing out some of the stories of Old Testament characters in their own lives. In early 20th century Korea and Japan. So this is what she says. After I quit being a lawyer in 95, I was having a lot of trouble writing. Then I read somewhere that Willa Cather read a chapter of the Bible every day before she started work. I thought, okay, I'll try it. Before each writing session, I started to read the Bible like a writer. I think that's a very interesting phrase, to read like a writer. Exactly what does that mean? What are you looking for in your source text? What kind of information are you gathering? How is it inspiring you to write your own text? And I think one of the things you can do most usefully as students, and certainly something I do, I realised, looking at this, as an academic, is that I do read like a writer. I'm looking for good models, I'm looking for resonant phrases, I'm looking to see what an author has done that I found particularly effective, because I find it helps, it's kind of grist to the mill of my own writing, my own creative and academic writing, which I think of as the same thing essentially. So I started to read the Bible like a writer, she says, thinking about language, character and themes. And as I read the book of Genesis, I started to see why the Bible has been the text, by which she means the original text, the basic text of so many and for so many Western writers of classics. It's such a rich text, one that could spawn thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of novels, poems and plays. So she thinks very interestingly about reading as a writer, I think, and she also thinks about what is a rich text. Hamlet clearly is a rich text. It's been read and rewritten over and over and over again. And I think as part of your thinking this week, if you think about what that means, that's really interesting. What is a rich text? What is a text that has multiple layers? What is a text that has ways in? What is a text that maybe resists the reader in certain ways or seems hopelessly old-fashioned in others and forces you to think about how you might reconceive it, how you might reimagine or rewrite it yourself. So what is a rich text? What does that mean? Why do some texts get rewritten more than others? So I want to think about rewriting in this way. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that I'm thinking about what we mean by rewriting. We might think of it as being derivative. We might think about it as being responsive, maybe, as answering something, as subverting, maybe, as striking back, as writing back, as simply writing. Maybe it's more about just writing. Does it always have to be an answer? And some of the writers that we're looking at this week are, I think, a little bit concerned about the way that their texts sit as secondary to something else. And does that mean that they too are secondary to something else, or does it not? Does it mean that they are taking something older than them and doing something new with it? And is that simply for them writing? What are they doing with rewriting? Derivativeness is something, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see is something that is often brought up as an attack on, an insult to texts which have that rewriting relationship with an earlier text. So, for example, derivative can be used as to mean, instead of what it supposedly means, to mean actually just disappointing or trivial. It's derivative, so therefore it's boring, right? You don't need to read it. There's an interview with Tom Stoppard by Maya Jaggi that I found quite useful in thinking about this notion of derivativeness. She talks about the theatre critic Michael Billington as having spoken about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. And he described it as derivative. This is the word that she uses to talk about how he has described it. He says a derivative of Hamlet, and it was also, and this is a really cutting phrase, I think, isn't it, waiting for Godot in Elizabethan costume. And there is something in that. It is clearly related to what Waiting for Godot, and Stoppard knows this, and it is performed in Elizabethan costume usually, but does that mean it's derivative to the point of being really rather uninteresting, as Billington implies? And Jaggi talks about this in the interview with Tom Stoppard. Similarly, there's a description of Nutshell by Ian McEwan. In similar terms, it's described by Tim Adams, the writer of this piece, as clever. He says, Nutshell is tricksy, and as with all novels based on self-consciously clever conceits, and by conceits he means kind of ideas or tricks, the danger is always self-consciously clever conceit, without the S, of course, which means, smugness, showing off. The writer is conceited. So he finds McEwan a little bit arch. He thinks he's being a bit too clever. He's kind of showing off here. The derivativeness is not dull, but on the other hand, it's in some way impairing to any idea of originality in the text. In some ways, it damages its seriousness. It makes it seem as though it's performing a clever trick, but one which is essentially fairly shallow. I want you to think about these responses and see how far they match yours and how you respond to these texts in similar ways. So derivative can indeed mean disappointing or trivial. Is that a way to think about these things, or should we be looking at another way of reading derivativeness? And I think this might help us actually. The way that I'm thinking about it on the next slide is about the idea of derive. So are they derivative as opposed to derivative? The derive is seen as something deviant and exciting. And I think that's a way that we might look at the idea of rewriting. It's a way of negotiating a familiar and mapped terrain in a new way, and it was originated by Guy Debord in the 1950s. It fits into that area of cultural criticism, which is usually known as situationism, and you can look that up and think about it if you want. It is basically a kind of anti-capitalist theory, and it creates the notion of psychogeography, which has so many famous practitioners today, people like Ian Sinclair and so on. That's a really interesting area to think about when you think about rewriting, I think, although it's not immediately obviously connected. But when you think about what the situationists did and what they saw their notion of the derive as being, I think you can see how it relates really interestingly to rewritings. When you do a derive, you don't follow a prescribed route. So, for example, you may decide to wander through Paris or London one day, not following a prescribed route, not going where your sat-nav tells you to, not going where the map tells you to, not following the directions that a friend gave you to get to a particular museum or train station. Instead, you deviate, you wander. You don't wander aimlessly, however, you wander purposefully. So maybe you follow some directions from another city route map. Maybe you walk through Paris holding a map of New York instead. And you think, oh, well, if I go up this side street in Paris, I'm actually going up a side street in New York here on this map. And if I follow these directions to get to Grand Central, where will I end up? So you might do that. You might overlay one city map on another and follow a map to a place that you're not going to on a completely different continent and see where it takes you to in the lived reality around you. You might, for example, choose to wander purposefully by following something in the environment that is around you, but not something that is about the usual kind of purposefulness. It's not about hurrying to work, it's not about going to seek something out. Instead, maybe you could look for the same colour on multiple buildings, or you could follow a vehicle of a particular kind and let it lead you. Maybe you could think about the ways in which people navigate the city through thinking about that, or you might think about the notion of themed architectural styles. You start to notice what is around you far more obviously than you would do if you were specifically looking for something. So the idea of a derive is about wandering purposefully, and it's about the kind of discoveries you might make along the route, cultural ones, social ones, political ones. You might end up in a part of a city where you've never been before. You might end up in a part where you don't especially want to be. Maybe you don't feel as safe there. Or maybe the people there are completely different from you. Maybe their businesses are different. Maybe you're in an area of the city which is one that you wouldn't normally be found, as it were, dead in. And maybe it's a financial district. Maybe it's a garment district. Maybe it's a district of social housing. Where have you ended up? And what terms do you use to describe it? Do you use the ones that I've just used, or can you think about it in another way? Where is your derive? Where has your deviance? Where has your wandering off the straight and narrow path taken you to? I think rewritings can quite often work like this. There's an idea of serious playfulness about some of them, about flaneurism is another way of thinking about it. So the idea of strolling or observing is one of the ways to think about a derive. And also parkour, so picking out as you go through buildings, sometimes at a higher level than street level, ways that you can negotiate them, ways that you can bounce from one to another, you can run from one to another. You can see this quite often in contemporary culture, and parkour is also seen as a subversive mode of navigating the city. So the derive is unproductive. It's unassimilated, it can be quite leisured, it can be quite pleasurable. It can be independent, it can set you apart, it can alienate you from the city and thus allow you to observe it. What is that? Is that silly? Is that trivial? Is it clever? Is it sort of clever, too clever? What does that actually mean for your way of reading a city and making it your own, of reading a text and writing your own text, making it your own? For my money, I think it's really quite interesting. It's a way of thinking about things which I think respects the original, but also creates something new. And I do find the derive quite a useful model for ideas of rewriting. So have a think about some of those. And in part 2 of the lecture, we'll move on to some of the specifics. The ways in which you can deploy this theory and thinking about them is laid out here in section 1. So in the first exercise, if you look at the next slide, I'd like you to find an example from each text that sums up for you a moment of similarity to Hamlet and a radical change from Hamlet. So maybe 2 different moments, maybe one moment or another, similarity or radical change. Where does the author stick closely to the source text? And where does the author break away and do something completely different? And make some notes on how you respond to each of these. You know, how do you read them? Do you like them? Do you dislike them? Do you think they're trivial and foolish or confusing? Do you think they're clever and insightful? What are they trying to achieve? And did they achieve it in that rewriting? What's old and what's new in each case? What did they bring to the original text and what did they create?